All right, welcome to 100 Days of Python, day 17. This is the 100 Days of Code Along with Me Python challenge, and we are on day 17. If you want the full index, you can go to my website at bmosley.com/hdp, and you can find that link below in the notes. And let's get started. Today, I'm going to build a really simple grid using what are called nested loops. And all a nested loop means is that there's a loop inside of a loop. So I'm going to have one loop that takes care of the vertical part of the grid, and another that takes the control of the horizontal part of the grid. So the first thing, let's just demo a couple of different ways of doing loops. So the first one is the while loop, and a while loop looks like this. Say if I have an X counter and I started at 0, and I say while X counter is less than 10, I'm going to do two things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to print the value of X counter. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increment X counter by 1. And there's two different ways to do this. The first way is the long way, equals, so X counter equals the value of X counter plus 1. So every time this line is executed, it'll say the new value of X counter is equal to the old value of X counter plus 1. Now the shorthand way of saying that is plus equals 1. That's the same thing. All that says is take this and add 1 to it. And so if I run this code right now, let's run it. It very quickly counts to 9. You can see it doesn't count to 10 because it says while it's less than that number, it's going to continue to do this. So it's going to say that, and when it gets to 10, it'll say, wait, it's not less than 10 anymore. So it's not going to print that final one. It's not going to print 10. If I wanted to print 10, I would have to say less than or equal to 10. And then it says starts at 0 and goes to 10. Okay, so if I wanted to start at 1, obviously I would start at 1, and now we have 1 to 10. Now, there's another way to do this. I'm just going to comment that out for now, and let's take a look at the second way to achieve the same thing. There is something called a for loop, and a for loop says for X counter in range. Basically, I'm saying for each thing in the range of 0 to 10, we're going to do something. And what it says is we're going to take this variable. And for every number in the range of 0 to 10, which is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, it never includes the second number. It just stops at whatever the stop is right before the second number. And the reason for that is that a range doesn't include the top number. That's the upper limit. And so it doesn't include that. So it will take, each time this loop executes, it will take one of those numbers and put it in this variable and then do whatever the variable says. So, or whatever the code says in the loop. So if I say print X counter inside that loop and I run that, you can see it does the same thing, 0 through 9. Now, if I wanted to say 1 through 10, I would change those numbers to 1 through 11 on the range, and then I get the numbers 1 through 10 printed. So there's two different ways to do that same thing. And if I want to, I can also say 11 to 1, and I can give it something called a step value, and the step says -1. Now I'm telling it to go backwards. So here's an interesting thing. Although I say 11 and 1 here, notice what it does. It starts at 11 and ends at 2. Again, the second number, it stops at the stop right before that. So if I wanted to say 10 to 1, I'm going to go or I'm going to say 10 and 0 here, then it starts at 10 and it's going to go all the way to 1, which is the last stop before 0, going backwards. So I can go backwards there. And the other thing I can do is if I want to say li letters, if I wanted to define a list of letters, which are strings, I could say A, B, C, D, E, F, oops, needs to be a string, and G. Let's say I have those letters, and if instead of this, I wanted the X counter variable to be one of those letters on each iteration through this list, I would say this instead. So now it says for each thing in this list, we're going to print that thing. So it'll, instead of counting in that range, it'll say we're going to take A and we're going to put it in X counter and then we're going to print it. Then we're going to take B, put it in X counter and print it, and so on. So if I run this code, there we go, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and there you have it. So those are some things that we can do to go through lists or to print things out using a loop. Now, if I want to, I can print a grid using X and Y values. So I'm going to go back to my while loop here and uncomment that. And I'm just going to use 2 while loops here, one inside the other. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say an X counter, and I'm also going to say while Y counter is less than or equal to 10, and I'm going to start Y counter up here. Y counter equals 1. I need to define that variable. And so both of them are going to start at 1. And inside of this loop, we're going to do this one. And for each while Y counter, I'm going to have to build a whole row because I have to print the whole row at once. So what a row looks like is going to be, I'm going to say Y row equals an empty string. And each time, right before we start the while loop, we're going to empty that out and we're going to make that row an empty string. And you'll see why here in just a minute. But what I'm going to do is for each time it goes through the Y counter, I'm going to print, or I'm going to add to that row. So Y row and dot equals, or plus equals, right? Plus equals, there we go. And what that says is, again, I'm going to add this thing to that thing. So I'm going to add, what am I going to add to it? I'm going to add X counter and I'm going to make that into a string each time so that I can add that to a string. And then I'm going to say plus str Y counter. And in between those, I'm going to put a hyphen. So it's going to print str X counter plus this plus str Y counter. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, just so I can keep my rows nice and even, I'm going to stay in the single digit numbers here. So I'm going to say 0 through 9 on both of these. And that will keep my rows nice and even because I'm going to keep it at single digits. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a space at the end. And then once that row is complete, then it's going to print Y row. the other thing we need to do is increment the y counter. Plus equals 1. So this is going to say, for each row, it's going to say the x counter, let's say, starts at 0. That's less than 10, so it's going to create a row. Then it's going to say, well, this is less than 10. And what we need to do before we start that counter is it always needs to restart at 0 right before we start counting. So for each row, we're starting at 0, and then we'll count to 9. And while we do that, we're going to build this string. We're going to build out that whole row of numbers, and then we're going to increment that until it becomes 9, and then we're going to print that row, and then we're going to increment the x counter. So let's see how this works when I run it. Okay, so there is my grid, and you can see it builds the row, x and y, x and y, x and y, boom, 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 all the way across to 0, 9. Then it starts out at 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, and you can see the pattern here. But you can see the second number is coming from the y counter, the innermost loop. That's why it increments here each time. And the first number is coming from the outermost loop, which is why it increments going this way. Okay? And so that is how you build a simple grid using nested loops in Python.